Well, good afternoon. And on behalf of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, welcome to this edition of the Dan Schnur Political Report. It's a real pleasure to have all of you with us today for, I know it's going to be a very interesting conversation on the war in the Middle East, what's happened after the ceasefire, but there's a lot more to talk about around the world and in this country that I know we'll be getting to, that Dan will be addressing throughout this talk. And we certainly want you all to be a part of that conversation today, and you can do that anytime. And by the way, I'm Richard Downey, President and CEO of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. But you can join the conversation today anytime by going down to the bottom of your screen, and you'll find the Q&A button. And you can type in your question anytime throughout this session. And our moderator, Madison Alt, will be there. The first 30 minutes will be our moderator, Madison, and Dan Schnur talking. But after that time, Madison will be handed your questions for Dan. And if Dan doesn't get to all of the questions for the group, which is usually the case, if you're a member, there's a members only session after this general membership session for everybody. And you can join there and your question will be answered. But if you're not a member, please join. We really ask and appreciate your joining the council. Doesn't matter if you live in the Los Angeles area or anywhere throughout the country. It really helps us to know where you are. We can send information to you. And by the way, we appreciate your contributions. I want to thank all of you who do contribute to help us continue to do events like this one and our in-person events. But those of you who can, please either go to the link in our chat box there, or you can go to our website, and it's very easy to do. Just click on the donate button. And by the way, if you haven't seen our new website, we have a brand new website. So I encourage you to go and take a look. There's a lot of work that went into that. So I hope you'll find it easier. If you need if you want to make any recommendations, well, we'd be happy to hear those. But let's get on to Dan's analysis of lots going on around the world. So thank you all again for being here. Dan, please.
Richard, thank you very, very much. And thanks, as always, to all of you for being here with us for this month's conversation. I always feel like over the course of a month, in between our conversations, there's far too much than we could ever hope to cover in a single hour, but we do our best to focus in. And for those of you who've seen our marketing materials over the last week or so, you know that tonight's focus is going to be on the Middle East, most specifically on U.S. and Israeli engagement, both in Gaza and Iran. But before we get to that, just over the last 24 hours, starting last night and through the day today, there's been major news elsewhere on the global front, in addition to the Middle East, and that's in Eastern Europe. And my guess is that most of you have heard this by now. But last night, President Trump overruled his own Pentagon and announced that he was going to restore U.S. weapon shipments to Ukraine, which is a dramatic shift of position for him on the Russia-Ukraine war. The president told White House reporters that the Ukrainian people have to be able to defend themselves. And it's worth noting that this is a really big moment for Trump. This is a very rare display of support for Ukraine. It's an even more rare show of animosity toward the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. And it's even a more rare break with his MAGA supporters, the overwhelming majority of whom have supported him because he had promised to end the war in Ukraine many more months than at least so far he's been able to do. This was exactly 1 week. This was 7 days after it was reported that large amounts of vital military shipments to Ukraine from the U.S. had been halted by the Pentagon. And it was widely assumed that Trump had ordered that halt, given the preferences he's been showing toward Putin and the animosity he's displayed toward Zelensky. But it turns out that's not the case. Basically, This is a power move by Trump inside of his own administration. And this is essentially Trump reasserting authority over a lot of people at the Pentagon, from Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, on down, who've been working very hard over the months to shift U.S. military focus away from Europe. But Trump told Zelensky in a phone call that he hadn't signed off on the decision, which puts Pete Hegseth in all sorts of trouble going forward. Now, that's part of the news. Trump's very dramatic shift in terms of supporting Ukraine with military weaponry, although probably not quite as much as had been originally committed. But as interesting is the way Trump has now begun talking about Vladimir Putin. Over the last several weeks, we've seen Trump being much more equivocal about Putin's commitment to end the war. But listen to some of this. This is Trump talking today at his cabinet meeting with White House reporters. Trump said, quote, "We're not happy with Putin. I'm not happy with Putin. I can tell you that much right now because he's killing a lot of people. We get a lot of BS thrown at us by Putin." And he didn't say BS. We get a lot of BS thrown at us by Putin, if you want to know the truth. He's very nice to us all the time, but it turns out to be meaningless. So Trump sounds angry. And what we don't know yet as to the long-term ramifications as it relates to the Ukraine-Russia war. But if the U.S. is restarting its support, particularly with Javelin and other anti-aircraft missiles, then that provides Ukraine's military with a huge shot in the arm, just as the summer fighting season gets underway, when it was widely expected that Russia would be able to make very significant gains. Anyway, I'm sure we'll talk more about this in the second half an hour tonight, and I know we'll be talking about it next month and the month after that and the month after that. But we promised you a conversation about the Middle East, so that's where we're gonna go. Now, as I think all of you know, Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, is actually in the U.S. this week. He's in Washington. And he and Trump had dinner at the White House last night in what was supposed to be the only meeting between the two men on this trip. Netanyahu's here until Thursday morning, but he was only going to see Trump that once, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. But after what I think we could all characterize as a pretty rough start between the two of them at the start of Trump's new term since January, Netanyahu and Trump have really been bonding lately, and right now they're closer than ever. The key to this, I think, was Netanyahu's decision to launch airstrikes over Iran last month. Because whether that was his goal or not, and I think it was one of his goals, those airstrikes did Trump a huge political favor, because it allowed Trump to share credit for the attacks with Netanyahu. Now, remember how this all played out. The first night of Israel's missile strikes, the White House did not comment at all. They were very distant, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, put out a statement on behalf of the administration that was very, very low-key and almost neutral. Then overnight, it became clear how successful the Israeli attacks had been. And by the following morning, Trump was talking about how we, quote unquote, we controlled the skies over Tehran. And then several days later, of course, he ordered the launch of U.S. attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. And although there's still some considerable debate in how much damage was done to Iran's nuclear program, there's no question that Trump has greatly enjoyed being part of that effort. So now Trump returned the favor a week or so ago when he announced that he thought the legal charges that Netanyahu's been facing in Israel for all these years, Trump announced that he thought the legal charges ought to be dropped. And in my own opinion, while Trump clearly empathized with Netanyahu, because of course Trump himself feels like the legal charges and the judicial fights that he's been facing are unfair, this also might be a Trumpish type of thank you to Netanyahu for allowing him into the Iranian mix. Anyway, so the bromance continues to grow. Last night, Netanyahu announced he was nominating Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, which is a sure way to Trump's heart. And like I said a few minutes ago, even though last night was supposed to be their only meeting on the trip, Netanyahu's actually back at the White House tonight to discuss, in particular, Israel's war with Hamas. And at least when we signed on tonight, there was not yet news out of that meeting. But keep an eye on news coverage tonight and tomorrow morning, because Trump wants this done and quickly. He wants this war over. He'd been hoping to announce a ceasefire this week. And Netanyahu now has enough political capital and enough public support at home that he could agree to a peace deal with Hamas, even without the most conservative members of his coalition on board. So let's finally, after all of that, and I apologize for the delay, let's bring all of you, let's bring our group into this conversation. So Krista, if we can put up our first question for the group. We haven't talked a lot about Gaza yet, and we will. But as we begin the conversation, we'd like your thoughts on whether Trump is, well, not whether Trump is right, but whether Trump will get his wish. When do you think that war will be over? Will it be next week? Will it be next month? Will it be next year? Or is it never going to happen? So, Krista, what does our group have to say about their thoughts on the prospects for ending the Gaza war? Very interesting. Look at that. Only 4% would say that Trump might be able to pull this off by next week. About a quarter, about 24% of you, a little bit less than a quarter, say next month. 27%, a few more, but pretty much similar, say next year. 45%, almost half of our group, says that that war is never going to be over. Maddie, pretty pessimistic group, don't you think?
I do. And I will say, our group still surprises me after all this time. And I know that you don't, I know how you feel about me asking you to make predictions, but have to ask you to answer the same question. When do you think the Gaza war will be over?
Well, look, this week, as Trump is still hoping for, he actually wanted to announce it yesterday, and then it became clear that Hamas is still dragging its feet on a number of items. This week is a stretch, but I would not be surprised if we saw at least a ceasefire by next week. Now, in fairness to our group, that's a different question than we asked them. An absolute end of the war is a different equation. But if other changes can happen in the Middle East, and we'll talk about those over the next 20 minutes or so, if in addition to stopping the fighting in Gaza, Israel is able to make progress with Saudi Arabia and some of the other Arab nations with whom they've had informal relations, but not formal normalized status, then I think it is possible that this war could end once and for all. So barring something barring something surprising, and of course surprises happen in the Middle East all the time, I could see a ceasefire within the next week or so. The full end of the war is going to depend on a lot of other things. But the thing to keep in mind is that Netanyahu's political standing is better than ever. This is the strongest he's been as Israel's leader in many years. And that allows him, as I mentioned a moment ago, to potentially move forward without the ultra-conservative members of his coalition and his majority coalition in the Knesset. The opposition leader in Israel, Yair Lapid, has essentially offered to provide Netanyahu the votes in order to pass a full cessation of violence, including a hostage release, of course, if Netanyahu is willing to go in that direction. And so I could see the temptation for Bibi to go for that. And on the other side, Hamas has simply been decimated. I think they are so willing to accept this ceasefire offer, not because of a change in attitude or a change in philosophy, but because they're just barely hanging on by their fingernails. Hamas's leadership is 90% gone at this point. But now even more difficult for them is they're losing control of large portions of Gaza to local militia. So the Gazan population is beginning to turn on them. And of course, neither Hezbollah or Iran itself is in a position to help. And if you've noticed, the rest of the Arab world has been pretty subdued since Israel's strikes on Iran a few weeks ago. So this doesn't guarantee peace. It doesn't even guarantee a ceasefire, but creates a series of incentives that might not otherwise have been there. The tougher question, and I'm going to ask Krista in our group to help me with this, is why this is happening now. As I said, the Iranian strikes may have helped ease Netanyahu's political situation. Hamas is still hanging on barely, as they have been for some time. But I guess the question, Krista, if you can put it up for our group, is specifically, do you believe that U.S. involvement has helped or hurt the prospects for a Gaza ceasefire? At the beginning of his term, Trump talked about how the ceasefire would come very quickly. After a while, he sort of got disgusted and seemed to walk away from it. But his administration did forward the ceasefire proposal that Israel has accepted and that Hamas seems optimistic about. So the question is, should the U.S. get credit in this? And if so, how much? You see the options here. The U.S. has helped a lot, has helped a little, has harmed a lot, has harmed a little, or neutral, has neither helped or hurt. What do all of you think? Did the U.S. move this in the right direction or further away? What have we got? Look at that. 60, if you combine helped a lot and helped a little, 65% of our group, almost 2/3 of our group, believe the U.S.'s involvement has helped the situation. Another 24%, almost a quarter of you, say it has had neither a positive or a negative impact. Only 10% in those third and fourth options, harmed a lot and harmed a little, only 10% think the U.S.'s role has been of negative impact. And we know, of course, Maddie, from prior experience, that our group tends to lean somewhat leftward. This isn't a big group of Trump supporters, but 2/3 of them believe that the U.S.'s involvement has helped. Interesting, huh?
It is definitely interesting, and I know one of the item of discussion right now is ceasefire, so I don't want to get ahead of myself with this, but given kind of where the conversation is leading and where our results are, I want to ask you what you think the prospects are for a Palestinian state existing independently.
Well, it's exactly the right question to ask. And, as you know, the Saudis, among many of the other Arab countries, have said that at least progress toward a freestanding Palestinian state is a necessity for an expansion of the Abraham Accords and broader normalization, and therefore hopefully peace in the Middle East. Now, the key phrase in that sentence is progress toward. Those two words are doing a lot of work in that sentence. And so the real question is, if Israel and Hamas are able to cease the violence, not just a temporary ceasefire, but ultimately end the war, the question then becomes, as you asked, at that point, what are the prospects for a Palestinian state? And it's going to sound like I'm weaseling out of your question, Maddie, but bear with me, because it really depends on the way you would define the word state. If Palestinians are willing to settle for a freestanding government that they themselves oversee, but if they're willing to allow outside forces to control security in the West Bank and Gaza, if they would consider that to be a Palestinian state, then I think it becomes fairly realistic, at least once the fighting is ended. And once again, not just a ceasefire, but a full end of the Gaza war. If Palestinians are willing to let outside forces, maybe Europe, maybe other Arab countries, if they're willing to put security of the affected area in those outside hands, then I believe that Israel could potentially sign off on this. Now, it's important to know that Israeli voters still oppose full statehood by huge numbers. And that opposition, not surprisingly, increased dramatically after October 7th and has not subsided since then. But if the security is handled externally, I think Netanyahu, or more likely Netanyahu's successor, could convince the Israeli people that that's a trade-off worth making in order to end broader threats of violence. So I certainly wouldn't call it a probability, but I'd call it a larger possibility than at any time in my memory. But once again, that all hinges on a cessation of the violence in Gaza. Now, we could stay on this easily for the next 10 minutes, the next 40 minutes, the next 3 hours. But while we're in the Middle East, I do want to spend some time talking about Iran, of course, because as I mentioned earlier, it really was the Israeli airstrikes on Iran, which more than anything has precipitated so much of the political and geopolitical movement that we've seen. So we'll start out, Krista and I, by putting to you the same question about Israel and Iran that we did about Israel and Hamas a couple of minutes ago. So question for all of you, how long do you think the ceasefire between Israel and Iran will hold? Trump was talking about the need for future negotiations between the US and Iran. He no longer thinks that's likely. The Israelis have let it be known that they believe that they have permission from the Trump administration to bomb Iran again if they see progress back toward nuclear capability. So this is a ceasefire, no question, but let's agree it's a pretty rickety one. Question for the group, how long do you think it'll hold? Next week? Until next month? Until next year? Or it'll never truly be solved? I'm not sure I would have predicted that. Once again, our group is very pessimistic. 50% say that the tensions between Israel and Iran will never be fully resolved in a peaceful way. About a quarter, 24%, said next year. About 22% said next month. And only 5% think it's going to happen immediately. And even though the group Maddie is similarly pessimistic as they were on Gaza, I'm more inclined to agree with them on the prospect of peace with Iran than I am with their thoughts on Hamas and the Palestinian territory.
All right. Well, that makes me happy to hear because I was just going to ask you, what do you think the odds of a ceasefire are? And given the attitude in our group today, I was hoping you could give us a little hope.
Well, I will say this, and maybe a little hope, but I'll emphasize the word little. I think where our group's instincts are pessimistic for understandable reasons, because I do agree with them. So I think they're coming from that there will never be lasting peace between Iran and Israel, at least as long as the current regime is in charge. But if Khamenei were either to step down, and there were all sorts of rumors about that during the Israeli attacks, or more likely if he were to pass away, he's well into his 80s, and if he were to pass away either through natural causes or more likely through violence, then all sorts of possibilities open up. Now, I don't want to get too carried away. This isn't the pink revolution from the early 2000s. This isn't the uprising from 2011, or even the mass protests from a few years ago. I'd say at this point, the Iranian military has very firmly established its control. And the protesters, the dissident groups, I don't think in the short run simply have the capability of successfully overthrowing the government. But here's what it's important to know about the military. While they are the next most powerful force in the country after the mullahs, most of the military's leaders are nationalists more than they're Islamists. In other words, their biggest priority is the nation and their control over it, than the religious faith, which obviously motivates the Ayatollahs and their regime. So a military-run Iran will never be Israel's friends. But if Israel can normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, as we were talking about earlier, and I think just as interesting, if Israel can normalize relations with Syria and Lebanon, which now looks possible for the first time in any of those countries' history, and we can talk about that more later if our group would like. But if Israel can come to a more normal situation with Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf states, and then again, not just with Jordan and Egypt, But with the Shiite crescent, the countries that have historically been Iran's strongest allies with Syria and Lebanon and the prospects there are looking somewhat better, then the prospect for violence would shrink quite a bit. So is Iran going to be a democracy? Probably not anytime soon. Are they going to be friends of Israel? Probably not in the near future. It would take a full restoration of a pre-Ayatollah situation there in order to see something like that happen. But even a militarized authoritarian Iran, if it sees the writing on the wall for its own survival, could decide that this ongoing antagonism, particularly without clients like Hamas and Hezbollah to help them, maybe don't end the violence forever, but certainly shrink the likelihood quite a bit. Once again, though, it's worth noting that while Israel, not the US, was the primary instigator in the aggression against Iran, it is important to acknowledge that Trump did authorize the use of the so-called bunker buster planes to carry the larger bombs to strike against Iran's nuclear facilities, which does seem to have been the crowning blow, if not destroying those nuclear facilities, which does not appear to have happened, but certainly to have caused the Iranian government to step back. So once again, Krista, let's ask our group about US involvement. The fact that there is a ceasefire there now, and the question we have for you is, has the US involvement helped or hurt in developing, in promoting, in holding the Iranian ceasefire? Has it helped a lot? Has it helped a little? Has it harmed a lot? Has it harmed a little? Or has it had no significant impact? So what has the US's role been in the at least temporary calming of violence between Israel and Iran, knowing, as we talked about earlier, that that's temporary, not permanent? Let's see what we got here. Also, really interesting results here. 84%, if you combine our top two categories, helped a lot and helped a little, 84% of our respondents believe that the US involvement helped. 10% said neutral, neither helped or hurt. And only 5% believe that the US involvement was harmful. So look, I know we have a range of political opinions among our group here, but it sounds like most of us are in agreement that whether or not we support the Trump administration on other matters, foreign or domestic, that at least on these two fronts, it appears that our group sees the administration as having been helpful, not harmful, in the Middle East. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Maddie.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, seeing that level of agreement seems a little uncommon in our group, but today they're really throwing me off. And I am just wondering, Gaia, what do you think about the events of the past few weeks on the current regime in Iran? Do you think that they've put it in more danger? Do you think more secure? Where do you think it's leading us?
I think at this point, it really is almost directly tied to the Ayatollah's health. Even though he has a plan of succession in place, just like his predecessor did, it's not entirely clear if he were to pass from the scene, either by stepping down or through death, whether his designated successors would be empowered to take over. And once again, I think that really does become a question that Iran's military leaders will decide. If the Revolutionary Guard, which does have a disproportionate number of Islamists, have control over the rest of the military or have suasion over the rest of the military, then the next in line probably does take over and this current regime stays in place. But as I said earlier, if you look at the broader swath of the Iranian military, they are more nationalist than they are religiously based. They're about Iran more than they are about Islam. And where they are of the Islam faith, it's not nearly as much of a priority for them. I do think, though, that segueing from a religious authoritarian rule to a military authoritarian rule, while it doesn't necessarily bring in democracy or freedoms, I think it is a necessary intermediate step before we see some type of true democracy emerge in Iran. I'm enough of an optimist to think that in the future, that will happen. Both those in the country who silently and not so silently resisted the regime, and the immense Iranian expatriate community here in Los Angeles and elsewhere around the world. But I do think you'll need to see secular leaders in charge before that next step of reform can take place. So we're at the bottom of the hour, but I do want to spend at least a couple minutes on Israeli politics before we go to our group's questions and comments. And I think given that we've talked about Gaza and given that we've talked about Iran and Israel's role in both, I think it's important to spend at least a couple minutes talking about how all of this has affected Israeli politics. And I guess, Krista, I'll ask you, we'll start this section by going to our next poll question for the group. And I'll be very interested in how you answer this one. Given everything we've talked about earlier, given the dramatic change of political fortunes that Netanyahu has enjoyed in recent weeks, and given how tenuous his standing is, even given those changes, I'm going to ask you a longer term question. Netanyahu himself has talked a lot over the years about his legacy. He says he wants to be remembered as the Israeli leader who made Israel safe. So by the time all is said and done, when he has left office, how do you think Benjamin Netanyahu will be remembered? Will he be remembered as one of Israel's best leaders ever? Will he be remembered as good, but only slightly better than average? Will he be seen as average? Yeah, okay, somewhat good, somewhat bad, but not dramatically in either direction. Slightly worse than average, or most dramatically as one of Israel's worst leaders. And the question, just to be clear for those of you who are voting, we're not asking for your opinion on how he'll be remembered. We're asking more broadly how you think he will be remembered, particularly by the people of his country. Okay, well, this one does not surprise me at all, Maddie. 69%, more than 2/3 of our group, believes that he'll be remembered as slightly worse than average, or as one of Israel's worst leaders. 44% think he'll be remembered as one of Israel's worst leaders. Only 7% think he'll be remembered as average, and that's probably a safe bet. I think just like on Trump, everybody has an opinion about Bibi, for good or bad. And then 24%, a little bit less than a quarter, believe he'll be remembered as better than average or as one of Israel's best leaders. Very interesting.
Very much so. And I do have to ask, if you were going to vote, which one are you choosing?
If I were going to vote, again, not for my own feelings, but I think how he'll be remembered, I think ultimately it depends how much of what we've talked about up until now takes place. In other words, if there's a ceasefire, and then if the war in Gaza ends, and then if Netanyahu is able to normalize relationships with the other Arab states, and if there is a two-state solution along the lines of the externalized outsourced security arrangements that I talked about, if all that happens, then he'll be remembered as one of Israel's best leaders, and he'll deserve to be so, because he will be the leader who ultimately brought peace to Israel for the first time in its history, either modern or biblical. But that's an awful lot to pull off. And depending on how many of those things happen and don't happen, you can see that having a very major effect on how he's remembered. So to a large degree, it's in his hands. But it is worth remembering, I mentioned a moment ago how tenuous his political standing is, even though it's enhanced right now. Remember where Benjamin Netanyahu was on October 6, 2023. He was very unpopular. He was facing a wide array of legal challenges in court cases. As a result, he was essentially held hostage to the most conservative members of the Knesset. And then Hamas attacked Israel. But even if we looked at a month ago, the beginning of June, Netanyahu once again was unpopular. Now the country was divided over the hostages and his abilities or inabilities to free the remaining hostages. and he was still very much a captive to the far right in his own parliament. Now this Iranian situation has, as I mentioned earlier, dramatically enhanced his political capital, greatly expanded his political support. I wouldn't be surprised to see him call for elections either late this year or early next year, given where his standing is now. And so, to me, ultimately, we're not going to know his legacy until all those other occurrences have either happened or not. But it is worth noting how much his situation has improved, not necessarily over the last 20 months, but over the last 20 to 30 days. I know we have other questions, but I'd say we're a little bit over at this point. And Maddie, if I'm guessing, we've probably got a pretty good number of questions from our group. So maybe we can move on to that just a few minutes late. What do you think?
I think that's a great call because you have guessed right, and we have a great long list of questions. Are you ready to jump right in?
Let's do it.
All right. So, first question is there any chance that there can be lasting peace in the Middle East without Palestinians having some form of self-determination?
I think so. And going back to what we said earlier, the question that really could make this happen or keep it from happening is whether self-determination reflects just their own domestic affairs or even diplomatic affairs, or whether it also includes military affairs. Because it's very difficult to see that a Palestinian state in control of its own military is something that Israel would ever sign off on. And while Israel doesn't technically have veto power over the region, it's become pretty clear over the last several weeks, if not the last year or so, exactly how much stronger Israel's military is than any other stakeholder in the region. But if the Palestinian people and their leaders were to see a state in which they had domestic authority, diplomatic abilities, trade capability, and so on, but that the military was overseen not by Israel, but either Arab or European or other external forces, I'm not sure if that would be called self-determination or not. If it would be, then it can happen. If that's not good enough, then self-determination is probably a long, long way off.
Alrighty. Thank you so much for answering that one. Now this one, it says, what are your thoughts about the sheiks taking over the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, as reported by the Wall Street Journal?
Well, this has been really interesting. For those of you who didn't see it, there was a fascinating article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, in particularly about the chieftain in Hebron, who's made it very clear that he's not happy with the Palestinian Authority and is interested in striking his own deal on behalf of other local and tribal leaders with the Israeli government. I don't have any independent way of knowing how legitimate or how optimistic or overly optimistic the article was, but it's a mark of how weakened Hamas is and how weakened the Palestinian Authority is, that these individual tribal leaders who've pretty much towed the company line for many, many years and have been more surreptitious in their cooperation with Israel are now willing to talk publicly. I don't know if it happens or not, but the possibility is a fascinating one. And once again, more than anything, I think it just tells us how weakened the existing Palestinian leadership has become.
Alrighty, thank you. This one, we're sticking in the same vein. Will participation and support by European countries enhance the Palestinian statehood prospects?
It probably helps. Having European support for Palestinian helps, but probably not all that much. Because I think what's noticeable is, with the possible exception of Ireland and maybe one or two other countries, even those who are inclined to support a Palestinian state, frankly, they don't feel that strongly about it. It's not a priority for them. And so I think in particular, as long as Iran remains as such a threat in the region, especially with its ability to block off the Strait of Hormuz, I don't think that it's likely that Europe ever engages in an ongoing or forceful way on the Palestinians' behalf. So philosophically, it's a point of encouragement the Palestinian government and its people. To some degree, it's a sign of something that causes a cause of frustration to the Israeli government and its people. But it's difficult to see a circumstance under which that becomes a sufficient priority across the continent for it to make a material difference.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Alrighty, and this one is it feasible to envision a future, is it feasible to envision a future Gaza without Hamas in a governing role?
I think it's very possible to imagine that. As I mentioned earlier, 90% of Hamas's leadership is now gone. And while they've demonstrated a capacity, as many terrorist organizations do, to repopulate their leadership by through newly converted recruits, I think at this point, the lack of support that they can expect from traditional allies like Hezbollah and Iran are going to make it much, much more difficult for them to hold on. I think the question at this point is how countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt decide to proceed. I don't think, I'll say this another way, while it's clear that an independent Palestinian state is a priority for much of the Arab world, Hamas's role in it is not a priority at all. And in fact, privately, the Egyptians certainly, but also Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, often tend to see Hamas as an irritant. And if there were a way to establish another governing authority, I think you'd see widespread support for that authority in the Arab world. Remember, a lot of the Arab states have supported the idea of the Palestinian Authority taking over Gaza as well as the West Bank. Israel, not just Netanyahu, but Israel, both Netanyahu and his opposition, think that's a bad idea for all sorts of reasons. But I feel like once the Arab world is comfortable with the Palestinian Authority taking over for Hamas, it shouldn't be that much more of a lift to get them to accept some other type of governing authority there.
Alrighty, thank you. Okay, this question is asking, do you believe that Iran's nuclear capability has been decimated?
I keep getting linguistically particular on you. Self-determined, freestanding state. I think this is another difficult one. Trump likes to use the word obliterated, which appears to be at least somewhat of an overstatement. There still isn't reliable intelligence on how heavily damaged the nuclear facilities were. It appears that they were damaged significantly, not insignificantly. They were damaged very significantly, but we don't know to what degree. What we also don't know is where the nuclear materials itself are. Are they sealed inside those facilities, as the US and Israel claim? Was Iran able to relocate those materials before the attacks? We just don't know. We do know, and this is something that tends to get overlooked in most mainstream news, we know that the conversion facilities, the facility in particular that converts the raw materials into fissionable material, we know that that was very heavily damaged. So even if the rest of the facilities were not destroyed, Iran's ability to construct a nuclear weapon has been, at the very least, delayed to a great degree. It hasn't been eliminated. How long it's been delayed or how badly it's been damaged, we simply don't know yet. But I'd say that the rather subdued reaction from Iran itself after its initial bluster suggests to me that the damage was heavier than they're publicly admitting. So it might not be as extensive as Trump is suggesting, but I wouldn't be surprised once we have more reliable intelligence if we see that the program was set back much longer than many have anticipated.
All right, thank you. This question, and again, we're speaking in absolutes here, so I'm gonna keep throwing them your way. Is how does a permanent end to the conflict depend upon Israel's change of government? For example, not far right as it is, I believe, currently.
Okay, well, once again, I'm going to have to nitpick on words with change of government. So there's two ways that the Israeli government can change, at least in the near future. One way would be for Netanyahu to leave office, either voluntarily or more likely by defeat, and to be replaced by the leaders of one of the opposition parties. Either Yair Lapid or Benny Gantz are probably the two most likely. Although Gideon Saar is another who might be considered, depending on how the configuration of the new majority came together. Here's what's important to remember, though. Every single one of those opposition leaders, Lapid, all of them, Gantz, you name it, are all former Likud, which means they were all part of Benjamin Netanyahu's party. And they all left not because of philosophical and ideological disagreements over Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran or the Palestinian Authority. They left because of their discomfort with the legal challenges that Netanyahu is facing. So if Bibi were to leave office and be replaced by one of the leaders of the opposition, any of the 3, 4, or 5 most senior members of the opposition coalition, what you'd essentially have is Bibiism without Bibi. And I don't think you'd see much change at all in terms of in terms of Israel's relationship with the rest of the region, Gaza included. Now, the other possible change of government would be more voluntary on Netanyahu's part. If Netanyahu, given the increased political support he's now enjoying after the airstrikes against Iran, if Netanyahu were to take Lapid up on his offer and say, I will accept supports, I'll accept votes from opposition members of the Knesset to remain leader in exchange for a full end of the Gaza hostilities, then Netanyahu would no longer be able to attract his ultra-conservative coalition members. They would leave. There's no way that they would stay with him, but he wouldn't need them anymore. So it's entirely possible that Netanyahu could decide that he doesn't need them anymore, and that he is popular enough now that he can accept the opposition offer, because Netanyahu knows that he can't end the war as long as he needs to rely on the ultra-conservatives. So there's an opportunity here for him. It's hard to predict how long it will last. There's no way to predict whether he will take it or not. But I think the likelihood of Netanyahu forming a unity government with the opposition is greater now, certainly, than at any time since the original Hamas attacks in October of 2023. But there's no way to predict a definite answer.
Yeah. All right. We're going to shift a little bit, still sticking on the Middle East, but this question is asking, what is Russia's role in the Middle East moving forward?
What is Russia's role in the Middle East going forward is a great question. And the answer is not much, at least for the time being. Because frankly, the war in Ukraine is taking all of Russia's not just military capacity, but most of its diplomatic and economic capacity as well. If you notice, the Russians, and the Chinese for that matter, put out fairly feeble statements on behalf of Iran after the Israeli attacks, but neither of them did anything about it. And think about that. Iran has been supplying Russia with weaponry for its fight against Ukraine for months and months now. In return, Putin did not lift a finger for Iran last month, because he probably couldn't have. He's really pinned down by a war of his own making. We know that his presence in Syria during Assad's fall there was minimal at best. So I don't think we see much of Russia in the Middle East until the war with Ukraine is over, one way or another, which incidentally, going back to the earlier question about the impact of Europe's support for a Palestinian state, if Europe, under its best of circumstances, is not all that motivated to push for a Palestinian state, they're certainly not going to devote a lot of time or energy to it when they're facing what they see as a much greater menace at their own eastern border. So as long as Putin is in Ukraine, it's difficult to see either him or the Europeans playing much of a role in the Middle East. They have more urgent matters to attend to, closer to home.
All right, thank you so much for that. This question is asking, would it be possible for the head of Iran and the head of Israel to meet in person?
Probably not. The negotiations, almost all of the negotiations between Israel and Iran have taken place between Netanyahu and Khamenei's representatives, but even those meetings haven't been direct. Most of their negotiations have taken place through middlemen, middle persons. And so a variety of Arab states have been playing that interlocutor role, but they don't meet face to face. It now appears that there have been at least some initial, very, very brief and very, very cursory face to face meetings between Iranian and Israeli government representatives. But those are mid level representatives, not even senior people in the government, certainly not the two principals themselves. I think if an Israeli prime minister and an Iranian leader were to ever meet in person, it would almost certainly be an Iranian leader different than this one, and probably an Israeli leader different than this one too. So it's a ways off.
All right, thank you. This question is asking, are we overestimating Iran's military capabilities?
Not anymore. I'd say that the US and Israel and most of the world have overestimated Iran's military capabilities for many, many years. And Israel's initial engagement with Iran last October demonstrated that they were not as powerful as much of the world had perceived they would be. And the more recent airstrikes last month made that point even more clearly. Make no mistake about it, without Hezbollah, without Hamas, without Syria, without Lebanon, Iran is a paper tiger. And they know it, and they know that the world knows it, which for the most part is really good news. But the cautionary note here is because Iran has been exposed as being so toothless in terms of its conventional military, there are some analysts that think it might increase their temptation to move more aggressively toward nuclear weapons. In other words, if they can't defend their own skies with missiles and conventional weapons, then maybe it is more tempting to seek out a nuclear option. Once again, these are the kind of things that are impossible to predict. But the bottom line is Iran is not nearly as powerful as the world had believed for many years. And in retrospect, we probably shouldn't have been fooled as long as we have. Because for those of our group with long memories, they may remember how Iran's war with Iraq ended all the way back in 1980. That after fighting for many, many years, the then Ayatollah Khamenei, before he passed away, essentially surrendered. And although he surrendered with very angry and very defiant language, ultimately Iran gave into Iraq because it wasn't able to win that war. And if Iran could not win a war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, it shouldn't be as surprising to us as it turns out to have been that it doesn't have more to back up its bluster in more recent years.
All right, thank you. This question is kind of touching on hypotheticals we were discussing earlier. And it says, is a Palestinian state split between Gaza and the West Bank viable, or should there be some geographical consolidation?
Well, once again, we're going to get nitpicky about words. The word is should.
Yeah.
Of course, there should be. Having a non-contiguous state, on one hand, depending on your own allegiances here, it's not really fair to the Palestinian people. And second, it's a very precarious and very dangerous position for Israel because it's going to be a lot more difficult to maintain a peaceful solution as long as two segments of a Palestinian state are not geographically joined. So now, does that mean that either the West Bank or Gaza becomes a Palestinian state? Possibly. Does it mean that there's some type of land bridge that links Gaza to the West Bank? It seems more likely from Egypt and Jordan's perspective that that would be the way to go. But I can't imagine Israel would like to have a throughway right through the middle of their country in order to connect Gaza and the West Bank. if I had to guess, I'd say Jordan would quietly just as soon see the West Bank go away, or at least in terms of Palestinian presence. Egypt would just as soon see Gaza go away because it's been a constant irritant to them. I think whichever of these two Arab states has more sway when and if we get to those level of negotiations will probably carry the day on which of the two areas becomes a Palestinian state. And I think the least likely result would be, particularly given their current strength, would be Israel agreeing to, we don't call it a land bridge. I guess we would call it an isthmus between the two regions. But short answer, there is no good answer. And either Israel or Jordan or Egypt is going to have to accept an outcome that they really don't want. Again, when and if this were to happen.
All right, thank you. This question is asking, do you think Hamas would still have formed if there hadn't been oppression and injustice by Israel?
Well, as all of you know who've been watching this webinar regularly over the years, you've heard me say two things. One, that it's very important to me when we present each month, not just me, but Maddie and Krista and the whole team, that it's not our job to take sides. You're all very, very smart people, and you don't log in to have somebody lecture you on why you're right or why you're wrong. So as you know, we do our best to avoid that. But as I've admitted to you on a number of occasions in the past, I personally am a very strong supporter of the state of Israel and consider myself a very strong Zionist. So I'm not going to hijack the last few minutes of today's conversation to espouse my own beliefs. But what I will note, even if it does reveal that Zionism more than some of you might agree with, I would suggest that before 1967, when the current Israel was created as a result of the Six-Day War, it's not as if the Arab nations were satisfied with a smaller Israel. In other words, there was not just terrorist attacks, but there was war against Israel from its independence in 1948 through 1967. So giving what the West Bank and Gaza back to the Palestinians, whether it's the Palestinian Authority or Hamas or anybody else, wasn't a recipe for peace for Israel's first 20 years of existence, when the Arab world did control all that land. And so it's difficult for me to believe, injecting my personal opinion into this briefly, it's difficult for me to believe that the same Arab world that fought against Israel so fiercely when the West Bank and Gaza did not belong to Israel, why that threat would subside if Israel were to give it back. The other thing I'd mention is it's worth remembering that when Ariel Sharon, who until Netanyahu was considered to be Israel's most militarily aggressive leader, when Ariel Sharon agreed to return Gaza to Hamas, he did so under the belief that it might lead. Excuse me, I misspoke. When Sharon decided to return Gaza to the Palestinian people, he hoped that it would allow a democracy to flourish there. Hamas won the following year's elections, has governed there ever since, and they have never indicated, certainly not on or since October 7th, 2023, that they would be satisfied with simply controlling Gaza. Otherwise, you can argue they would have never attacked the country of Israel on October 7th. Anyway, I rambled a bit on that. I think I gave a little bit more of my own thinking on that than I generally prefer to. But the content of the question, I think, required an honest answer. I've answered to the best of my abilities. Maddie, you've got time for one last question where I can restore my Switzerland status?
We do indeed have one more, and you've timed it perfectly. This question is asking, is there any chance the Saudis would agree or would join the Abraham Accords without a two-state solution?
I think so. Although Saudi Arabia, particularly since October 7th, since the Hamas attacks, have indicated that was a bottom line condition For many years, they indicated that progress toward a Palestinian state was sufficient. Honestly, I don't think the Saudis really care all that much if there's a Palestinian state, but the ruling family there is very, very wary of the Arab street in that country and otherwise. And the House of Saud needs to maintain some level of domestic control. They can't afford violence against their regime. And so I think something that they can sell plausibly as progress would be good enough for them, as long as it avoids violence and uprisings in their own country. And the type of security situation we talked about, I think, is at least a possible resolution that could get them there.
Thank you so much. That's the last of our questions. You hit it right on time.
Maddie, thanks so much. As always, you do a great job on this. I really appreciate it.
Madison, you really do. Thank you very, very much. And Dan, thank you for a terrific analysis all around the world. And, you know, I think it's worth mentioning. Everybody knows this, but to have the analysis that you give that's not filtered through a political prism is just so refreshing. You know, we all get bombarded by whatever media we are listening to, but to hear analysis that's not biased, or if it is, you note it. Whether you have some bias, you let us know, and that's unusual and refreshing. I just want to thank you so much for the kind of insights that you give all of us. So I appreciate it.
Well, it's very kind of you, Richard. Thank you very much. You know how much I enjoy it.
Yeah, we do, and we enjoy it hearing you talk about it. And I want to thank our audience. Some always great questions, very, very helpful to get that kind of dialogue. And if you haven't had a chance to get your question answered, please you can stop on to the members only session that follows on. So, and if you have not, please join as a member. Come to our new website, check that out. And again, thank you for those who have donated to keep the activities that we do and the events that we are doing going. We appreciate that very much. And if you haven't donated or you have a position to do so, once again, it's in the chat box. There's a link or there's a button on the website that you can go to. And I do encourage you to please check out our new website. I think you'll be impressed and find it and enjoy seeing what's there. But we really appreciate all of you joining us. I especially thank Madison again for being moderator, as well as Krista Seitz and Brianna Rue, our new communications manager, for being on the poll part, on the back end part of this. So thank you all very much. And I wish all of you a great night. Thanks again, Dan, for a terrific session.
Thanks, everybody.